part of this series, I want to maybe assess a little bit more what actually causes fear, and get a little bit more into how we react to it. Well, in the past, I've described how cognitive heuristics cause our mental processing to alter in response to what we perceive as an imminent threat, and how that may create an immediate jump scare fear response due to our quick assessments of media events, given our inability to properly differentiate between reality and media on a short-term, instantaneous basis. This time, we have to look at other kinds of fear, because that's not all that horror media is. It's not just jump scares. I mean, certainly, that would not explain why we would read a horror novel. These instantaneous and quick responses are then subsequently processed more thoroughly by the left-hand side of the brain, the center of complex reasoning and long-term memory. Of course, based on our shared cognitive heuristics, we are prone to responding in momentary fright, freeze responses to a jump scare. But again, that does little to explain something like psychological horror or suspense, which is based less on heuristic processing and more on the development of a long-term period of malaise and malcontent in response to a narrative or series of events. What we consider horror and psychological thrillers are often disparate things, right? Horror tends to be more typified by gore and violence and shock, while psychological horror seemingly describes a series of disconcerting emotions. Now, if all that makes us scared is really just a form of psychological retaliation, of heuristics and instantaneous processing, why would psychological horror scare us? At least when it comes to me, I don't find gore all that entertaining. I mean, it's cool, it can be entertaining, but it fascinates me more than it terrifies me. When it comes to things that really have given me nightmares in the past, well, jump scares tend to be pretty low on that list, if at all. Once again, it's hard for us to eliminate our instantaneous responses to something that our brains would view as potentially dangerous. That's just you taking care of you. That is, one last time, precisely though why we jump at jump scares. But yeah, then what about more thoughtful horror? I mean, that would describe all my favorite horror films as thoughtful, or at least slow and prodding, depending on how you like to think about them. There's certainly very creepy, reaction-oriented moments in some of my most beloved silver screen scares, for example, Noroi the Curse, my favorite all-time horror film, as well as most of the other, and I am using this term correctly, Lovecraftian sort of film series that is attributed to director Shiraishi Koji. Another movie that's also very close to my heart is A Tale of Two Sisters. One thing that all those films have in common, though, is a slow build. While they may have some jump scares, that's not really what makes them so great. What makes them great is long and deliberate tension building. So as we've learned in this series that sensation seekers are more likely to seek out horror as it increases arousal, it seems that sensation seeking would not have a whole lot to do with a film like, for example, this fucking gen, the color of which looks abysmal. I happened to uncover this on Netflix a few years ago. Absentia. It's a micro-budget film that was kickstarted, where almost nothing happens, and then what does happen mostly occurs off-screen or in an obfuscated manner. If I'm just high in sensation seeking, why would I love Absentia when there is little in the way of direct threats that would evoke that sensation seeking enjoyment of high arousal states? Well, it's because there is more to it than just being male or female or wanting to be more excited. I think there's a little bit more to it than that. Going back into something I've described a bit during this series, and in detail in the previous videos, once again this kinda goes back into liking, similarity, and parasocial relationships. You know, my favorite thing to talk about. That is, as previously explicated, we tend to root for characters we like and root against characters we dislike. We like characters for any number of reasons, including their similarity to us, or shared in-group association, as we have been over in, for example, my analysis of why people like YouTubers and tend to view them as their friends. But unlike watching YouTube every day over the course of a year or several years, a single film gives one very little time to form complex associations with a character or series of characters, particularly when you're talking about something like horror, where it's not really generally so character-focused. Sure, in a drama, yeah, the entire focus is on the characters. That means that the film is going to rely heavily on character interaction and to building up that parasocial relationship that we feel towards these media figures. But despite the fact that any horror movie can get a quick scare out of you, if they want to really terrify you, I think they need to get you to like the characters. And moreover, to understand them, in order to form what Bryant 2002 described as victim sympathy or justice deservedness that can be attributed to any character within the narrative. These emotions that we would feel towards a character of deserving of justice or deserving of sympathy are kind of simplistic. probably because horror movies do have to keep things moving a little quickly in order to scare you, but we do have to feel something for the characters. Unlike, again, a drama where you might have far more complex relationships with the characters, feelings of sympathy or deserving of justice are what we typically see in horror narratives. This also works better in more, well, simplistic narratives with an obvious good guy or bad guy. It also serves to explain why so many people come to love characters like Freddy Krueger, a character with an interesting personality, and an instance where we may believe on some level there is a amount of deservedness laying upon the characters that he's murdering. Unlike more simplistic narratives, we're given a lot of time to understand Freddy Krueger's character. That's why people form a parasocial relationship with him and maybe don't think he's so deserving of justice, unlike more simplistic horror villains. While I described in the previous video that women may be more likely to enjoy moral tales than men, being more likely to focus heavily on moral judgments and their dispositions, however, generally speaking, all people rely on our morality to more or less degrees to determine how we're going to respond to media figures. Hannibal Lecter may be a horrible villain in his actions, but many people love him as a character because of his wit or his intellect. I mean, he's certainly arguably the most well-developed character over the series of films and media he's been in, and as such, the more time we get to like Hannibal, and the more and more reasons we have to learn about him and reinforce our liking. These likable villains then may explain why, despite our need to form relatively quick decisions about a character's morality, over the course of time, even a mere hour-and-a-half long film, why then would we still find people rooting for the proposed villain over the heroes? Cabin in the Woods, of course, being a deconstruction of Western horror, breaks down this dichotomy quite well, in that the bad guys, such as they are in fact attempting to save the world in a way, and the good guys, in contrast, are self-centered, egotistical dicks. Let me give you a personal example of one of only 2 movies I have ever walked out of in the theater. I will sit through some real bullshit. The first one was Cloverfield because it made me feel sick. Just the motion camera, and I love cinema verite, it was just something about it, I couldn't do it. But the other one was Drag Me to Hell. Fairly early on in the film, the main character, as soon as she is given any inclination that she's under a curse, decides to kill her pet cat. As soon as I saw that, I realized I hated the main character. I was going to want her to die, and that a lot of the tension from the film, given I didn't think there was really going to be a bad guy to root for, I mean, I guess the witch, was going to leave me. I wasn't going to enjoy it because I wanted the main character then to die. That might seem extreme, but again, this is a media figure. On some level, I know it's fake, and I've already formed a very strong moral judgment against the main character. As such, yes, sometimes the enjoyment of a film, for other people, in that particular instance, I was just so pissed off, I didn't want to keep sitting through it, but in some instances, we may want to see our technical heroes get this shit fucked up out of them, because they violated some moral norm, and now I believe that they are deserving of justice, not of sympathy. And speaking of Cabin in the Woods, I want to make a quick aside here in explaining the role of female characters in horror. As I described in the previous episode, of course there is generally societal greater fear for the safety of women, and men in high sensation-seeking express general liking of media that depicts female victims, likely because it evokes evolutionary defense mechanisms of desiring to protect and defend her. There are a couple of other things too that may explain how we look at female horror protagonists when processing the deservedness and victim sympathy elements of horror. As I explained before, based on mere numbers, women are more likely to be the protagonists of horror films, particularly slasher films. Generally also, as such, the victims in horror in general. While people may care more for the woman from an evolutionary perspective, it would seem quite odd for us to want to see women getting hurt or winding up with a bad end. We want them to be sympathetic, right? We are more sympathetic towards women. Why then would we want to see this, knowing men who generally prefer horror also are more likely to want to preserve the lives of women? Well, Weaver 1986 might provide us with some answers. Participants in this experiment watched a piece of media, and then were asked to assess the potential for incarceration of an accused rapist in a mock trial. Subjects were most likely to excuse the accused rapist after having watched non-violent pornography with a sexually aggressive woman, followed secondly by violent horror and rape, and finally, least likely, after watching 2 involved romantic partners in a pornographic video. That is, after watching media with women who were essentially portrayed as sexually indiscriminate hoe bags, the rape accusation was seen as less credible. What this means is we're likely to feel lower levels of empathy for women when we view them as being promiscuous, when we view them as morally wrong in some way. As such, well, despite our societal and evolutionary norms to desire to protect women, maybe when we see them as being more deserving of their harrowing fate, of justice if they've been slutting it up for the first 30 minutes of the film. This would be quite in line with the deconstruction that we do see in Cabin in the Woods, right? You turn the blonde girl into a total whore, and the guy into an asshole, and let it play out because now they're less deserving of sympathy and more deserved of justice, right? Okay then, let's say the film doesn't have a likable villain or potentially no villain at all, as is the case in most of my favorite horror. It has few to no jump scares designed to activate your subconscious fear response heuristics, and no truly dislikable sluts or assholes hanging around that we want to see get their comeuppance. Well, what's left? There's still victim sympathy, as I described, and what determines that? Again, this goes back to parasocial research on some level, which means that it involves a level of feelings of similarity. In the field of horror, liking is important as it allows the media consumer to engage in a vicarious experience of terror due to their liking and association with the media figure. That is why, in my opinion, the best horror is horror that spends a quite decent or lengthy period of time establishing characters and allowing the reader, the player, the viewer, whatever, to develop a connection with the protagonists in a liking manner, rather than just as revenge outlets getting their just desserts via our emotional motivation or merely a series of jump scares. That's really powerful horror, when you like the character and feel sympathy for them and want them to succeed. This goes back again to excitation transfer theory. If we really like the character, if the best possible outcome is just that they survive, well, then my excitation is going to be so much higher because the character survived. Even if it's in an ambiguous way. I don't know how you guys feel about the movie Silent Hill. I'm obviously a fan of the games, but I also really like that movie. It has a very ambiguous ending where can we say the characters even survived? I won't spoil it for you. But I think that's a great film, and I like that ending because of its ambiguity. The more we like a character, the more we are prone to feel with them in an empathetic process based on our parasocial interaction. But that takes an extended period of time to allow the perceiver to form any kind of that relationship such as that. As such, while it's very easy to create horror responses based on the previously explicated methodologies, to have a jump scare, to want to see someone get their just desserts, to really get someone to experience terror vicariously, you really need to get them to identify with the protagonists or primary characters parasocially. I mentioned that my favorite horror film of all time is Noroi the Curse. Well, it's a perfect example of this. With a runtime of just under 2 hours and having a main cast of well over 25. And while it doesn't have a happy end, again, we can go back to mood management theory or any kind of the other traits that I've described, of other reasons why I might like that, particularly given that I like the main characters. But this also kind of goes into the last area I want to discuss, which is emotional stimuli, and how we respond to horror, of which Cantor 1998 describes in 3 factors, that at this point we have actually covered in detail, interestingly enough. First, there is motivation for exposure, as we described in the first video, that particularly bored people, for example, may be more likely to respond positively to horror because, well, they're bored and want to be aroused. This first factor is essentially our state-based reasons for seeking out horror. Second are the general traits and emotionality that we have as individuals, as we discussed in the second video. Thus, for example, what differences between people might make one more or less prone to seek out horror, be it their biological sex, their proclivity towards sensation-seeking, or any other number of the factors described in the second portion of the series. Finally then, we have the part I really wanted to talk about in this video, and that is degree of similarity to real experienced fear or fear emotions. As I've already described, similarity to the protagonist is likely to encourage fear as we feel it vicariously with a parasocially associated media figure. But another thing that has a great deal to do with what spooks us is that, well, what spooks us in real life. I didn't mention this factor in the traits portion of this series intentionally because I don't think it's necessarily that kind of thing. It's not a definitive trait. It's this own hard to nail down variable that I couldn't really place easily into a group of trait tendencies, unlike some of the other things like sensation-seeking or Machiavellianism. What I mean is each of us have our own and unique and very difficult to quantify fears. Frankly, getting at what truly scares us requires someone with a more qualitative rather than quantitative analysis. That is, getting more into understanding of the why rather than the what from a more numerical standpoint. As such, let's get a little bit away from the data, and you know how much I struggle with that, and get more into the philosophical, the abstract analysis of horror. I want to start this by saying there is a great series of videos from Plague of Grapes where I believe he goes over this concept superbly in terms of describing what makes us horrified and how to really scare the fucking pants off of someone most effectively. I think he's generally correct in his analysis, and as such, much of what I'm about to describe here is essentially a rehash of his videos, but with my own twist and understanding. People simply tend to be more afraid of media that depicts something they have a negative personal experience with, something they're actually afraid of. For example, childbirth, or a childhood negative interaction with an aggressive dog. See Sapkowski and Zillman 1978, Weiss, Kotlin, and Rubin 1968. The problem when it comes to those who construct horror then, that is, media creators, well, as I just described, this is an incredibly individualistic factor that we couldn't in any way reasonably sell to any portion of the public based expressly on those essentially unknowable internal terrors that are unique to any one individual. What then may be the best way to speak to those fears? Well, quite simply to, in my perspective, neither show too much nor tell too much. We often hear of media, the creative idiom, show, don't tell, but in horror, I think it's probably best to rein it in on both, show just a little bit, and tell just a little bit. Just enough. The way that the human brain works, based on our heuristic processing, as we have been over, is that we will tend to fill in the blanks with information that is not readily available based on what data we can assess. This is, again, why we see a stick and jump back, thinking it may be a snake. Why we screech when we see a shadow that looks like it may be an intruder, or maybe just even a little spider. The fact is, different things affect and scare all of us to different degrees, and by obscuring the object, the monster, or villain, the most terrifying thing of all, our own minds, are forced essentially to fill in the gaps with our own catalog of personal fears. For example, I'm terrified of insects and bugs. I just hate them, based on my own personal experiences.
I hate insects.
You know, lots of people are afraid of insects.
Aiden.
Just, it's a natural, instinctive...
No, I'm not afraid of them. I hate them. One day back when I was a kid, I was climbing this tree when I noticed this leaf walking towards me. It took me forever to realize that it was no leaf.
A praying mantis?
Yeah, I had a praying mantis epiphany, and as a result, I screamed. You know, not a girly scream, but the scream of someone being confronted by some before unknown monster that had no right existing on the same planet I inhabited. Did you ever notice how a praying mantis's head resembles an alien's head? I mean, the mysteries of the natural world were revealed to me that day, but instead of being astounded, I was repulsed.
Aiden.
Are you sure it wasn't a girly scream?
Other people may not be so bugged by bugs, yet may instead be terrified of snacks. First of all, let's get this straight. Snacks are adorable, snacks are cute, boop them on the snoot. But, see, that's my prejudice in my own fears speaking. I like snakes, so a snake monster is unlikely to scare me. I mean, if you made it significantly different from a snake to the point where my brain didn't really understand what it was looking at... Yeah, that might work, but that's precisely what I'm talking about here. For someone who loves bugs, well, a roach monster is probably unlikely to scare them. Again, unless you obfuscate it or make it so confusing that your brain is struggling to comprehend what it's looking at. Our brains, particularly in a stressful situation, are working overtime to try and understand what's happening in front of them. And when you obscure or you show something that doesn't make any sense, that looks backwards and broken, and our brain has no real frame of reference to understand it, well, that creates fear, because what's left is whatever your brain can piece together about what it's looking at, and that's going to be based on your emotional memory processing, which is activated when the hypothalamus, when that arousal, fight, flight, fear response is also activated. This is why I think things in horror are best when they are hidden, subtle, or obfuscated, like I said, or incredibly messed up and disturbing. If I can't quite see or understand what I'm witnessing, again, it forces my brain, which is ideally already feeling a degree of liking and care for the protagonist of the narrative, to fill in the blanks of what it can't fully comprehend. And given the high aroused nature, well, it's probably going to fill in the blanks with the nightmares of my own subconscious. For me, maybe I'll see elements of a creepy crawly insect, but maybe you'll see more elements of a slithering adorable snack, simply protecting his property. Government, fuck off. Anyway, the point is, if I can't quite make out or comprehend what I'm looking at, it's up to my very basic animal brain to figure it out and figure out how to respond to it. And when you're already on edge, when you're already aroused, as the horror film should have been doing at this point, or any form of media by creating tension, it's likely going to go to the places of my memory stored within the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain, which is being most directly assessed based on the activation of the hypothalamus from our aroused state, and it's going to look into our own history, at our own extant fears and terrors to explain the experience of this current emotional state. Do you understand what that means? That the greatest thing to fear in many ways is actually fear itself, or at least our own experience of it. Think about Lovecraftian shit. I mean real Lovecraftian shit. The monsters are usually described as being, well, undescribable. What the fuck does that do to one's brain? It makes you forced to figure out what something so terrifying it drives a man insane might look like, sound like, smell like, etc. Truly, the most terrifying thing is our own minds. Also, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about existential horror, the fear of the unknown, and madness, all of which comes along with Lovecraft, I again have to plug my boy and senpai, Dr. Layman, who recently put out a video on it. There will be a link in the description and in the card here. Definitely go check that out. He gets more into the Lovecraftian shit than I am going to do here, because this has been a long series already. And that's just a pleasant place to end, isn't it, dear friends? To know that the writer, artist, the director, or any kind of creator will never ever really be able to likely create anything more disturbing than the shit that's rolling around within your own noggin. That is horror, and that's why I love horror. Not because of our motivations to seek it out, our individual traits or biological differences that may make us more or less likely to enjoy it, but the mere knowledge that the most terrifying shit you can imagine is just that. The most terrifying shit you can imagine. And with that, we end our series. So sour dreams and dark nightmares, friends, sleep well in the knowledge that the deepest horrors rest not within the deep unknown recesses of the universe at the edge of all knowledge, but really within your own skull, and are waiting at any moment to seep into your waking and conscious perception.
The world needs more horrifying stories that make you realize what a horrible, insecure person you are. Because you are a horrible, insecure person, and you need someone to remind you about it.
If you've enjoyed this video and this series, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.